They stood facing each other beneath the cliffs, two worlds, both human yet utterly alien to one another. On one side, the newcomers, Neolithic farmers, their lives tied to earth, to seed, to the rhythm of sun and rain. On the other, the last hunter-gatherers of Europe, wild, free, bound only to the hunt and the wind. Neither could understand the other's way of life, but both knew one truth: there wasn't enough land for them all. When the first arrows flew, they didn't just pierce flesh. They shattered the illusion that civilization would tame us. Because long before kings, armies, or borders, there were battles, silent wars painted on cave walls, where the story of human violence began. So tonight, we'll return to that forgotten world, where farmers and hunters collided in blood and fire, and where the meaning of civilization was written not in words but in wounds. The first thing you notice is the silence. Inside the cave, sound doesn't travel. It lingers. Every step echoes softly off walls stained with smoke and time. And there, illuminated by a flickering flame, are the figures. Painted thousands of years ago, yet still alive in the rock. Hunters, animals, and something else. At first it looks like a dance. Tiny red silhouettes, their bows drawn, arrows flying through the air. But as your eyes adjust, you see the truth. The figures on the ground aren't sleeping. They're fallen. These aren't scenes of triumph or ritual. They're scenes of violence, painted by people who lived and died long before writing existed. For centuries, scholars believed prehistoric art was only about animals, magic, and hunting. But scattered across Europe, from the limestone shelters of southern France to the cliffs of eastern Spain, are haunting exceptions. Walls that tell stories of human-on-human conflict. At Les Dogues, a line of archers marches forward in formation. At El Tendo, bodies lie pierced by arrows, limbs twisted in agony. These are not the works of detached observers. They're memories, perhaps made by witnesses, survivors, or even the killers themselves. And yet, despite their brutality, there's beauty in the detail. Each archer carefully painted, each arrow perfectly placed. It's as if the artists wanted the violence remembered, to make sure no one could ever say it didn't happen. When we look at these walls today, we're not just seeing art, we're seeing evidence of the first recorded wars in human history. Every mark on the cave wall meant something. A hunter's bow drawn to full tension, the lean curve of a fleeing body, the precise cluster of arrows striking home. These weren't random doodles. They were language, painted in ochre and blood, told in silence. Some of these scenes date back 6,000 or even 7,000 years, long after the Ice Age had passed. The glaciers retreated, the forest returned, and with them came a new kind of human. Farmers, people who settled, planted, and defended. The world was changing, and so were its stories. At first glance, these painted battles look like chaos, a blur of limbs and weapons. But look closer and patterns emerge. Two groups facing each other, one advancing, one retreating. Numbers that matter. 18 attackers against 11 defenders. The artists cared about balance, about odds. They weren't only telling what happened. They were recording the rules of conflict. And then there are the details that stop you cold. One fallen figure has arrows in his chest and thigh, but one more to the throat. Another lies crumpled beneath the feet of others, as if trampled in flight. In some panels, bodies are stacked or shown mid-fall, frozen in their final moments. You can almost feel the rhythm, the whistle of arrows, the heartbeat before impact. It's hard not to imagine the painter pausing, looking at a body cooling on the ground, and knowing this moment will be remembered, through paint, through rock, through time. When archaeologists first discovered these scenes, they didn't know what to make of them. Were they myths, ceremonies, or real memories frozen in pigment? But the more evidence surfaced, the clearer the truth became. These were not symbols. They were stories. Stories of ambushes, retreats, and last stands. The artists weren't imagining war. They were living it. Some caves, like those in the Levantine region of Spain, reveal entire choreographies of death. Dozens of tiny archers sprinting across stone, each one painted in deliberate, rhythmic strokes. Their movements so alive, you can almost count the seconds between the first arrow loosed and the last body falling. In one shelter, 5 archers stand shoulder to shoulder, bows drawn in perfect unison. That kind of coordination doesn't come from chaos. It comes from discipline, From war practiced often enough to become routine. And that's the chilling part. These paintings show us that violence wasn't born from civilization. It existed before it. Before kings, before borders, before writing, humans already knew how to hate and how to fight. Yet among the carnage, there's a quiet sadness in one scene. A figure carries another, limp, lifeless, while across the field. Maybe a friend, maybe a brother, someone worth remembering, someone worth painting. For the first time, art became memory, and memory became warning. Because once you've seen your own kind die by your own hand, you never see the world the same way again. 7,000 years ago, the world was changing faster than ever before. The Ice Age had ended, forests spread across Europe, and the old ways of life began to vanish. For tens of thousands of years, humans had survived as hunters and gatherers, moving with the herds, following the seasons. But now a new kind of people were arriving. They came from the east and the first farmers. They brought seeds, livestock, and a way of life bound to the soil. Where the hunters saw land to roam, the farmers saw land to own. And that single difference would change everything. At first it might have seemed peaceful. Trade, maybe even friendship. The farmers had food security. The hunters had knowledge of the land. But peace between worlds built on such different values rarely lasts. Soon, the forests that once echoed with the calls of deer began to fill with the sounds of axes. Clearings opened, settlements grew, and fences began to mark what could and couldn't be shared. For the hunters, it was the beginning of an ending. Their paths blocked, their herds scattered. For the farmers, it was survival, the right to protect what they had built with their hands. And so, one morning, in a narrow valley surrounded by cliffs, the two worlds met, not in trade but in battle. That day, the story of Europe's first war began. The discovery came from a quiet place called Talheim, in modern-day Germany. What looked at first like an ordinary trench turned out to be something far darker. A mass grave. Dozens of skeletons buried together. Men, women, children, every skull told the same story, crushed, split, or pierced. Some had arrowheads still lodged in bone, others bore the unmistakable fractures of stone axes. No signs of ceremony, no offerings, no care. Just a pit filled with the fallen. For decades, archaeologists debated what had happened. But the truth, written in wounds, was undeniable. This was no accident. It was a massacre. The victims were early farmers, people who had built homes, raised animals, grown crops. Their killers, likely neighboring tribes, perhaps hunter-gatherers displaced by the spread of farming, or rival farmers fighting for territory. It was, as far as we know, Europe's first organized act of war. And it wasn't an isolated event. Across the continent, more mass graves appeared. Aspern-Schletz in Austria, Schöneck-Kilienstetten in Germany. Each one echoing the same brutal message. Humanity had crossed a threshold. For the first time, violence wasn't about survival. It was about land, control, power. The farmers had learned what every civilization since would rediscover. When you plant roots, you also plant borders. And borders, sooner or later, demand blood. As the smoke cleared in Talheim's valley, a new kind of world was born, one where progress and destruction walked hand in hand. After Talheim, something in humanity changed forever. The age of wandering had ended. From now on, people would live and die in the same place, and that meant learning how to defend it. The first villages began to wall themselves in. Ditches became moats. Palisades rose around wooden huts. And inside those fences, something new began to grow. Identity. For the first time, humans weren't just people. They were us, and everyone else was them. That simple division reshaped the human story. Archaeologists call it the Neolithic transition. But for the people who lived it, it was more than a shift in how they farmed or hunted. It was a shift in how they belonged. When you depend on your land for life itself, for food, for shelter, for family, losing it becomes worse than death. So you fight. You remember. You teach your children who the enemy is, and slowly, the world learns that peace isn't our default state. It's the exception. By the time the first walled towns rose in the Fertile Crescent, the logic of war was already in our bones. The same hands that carved tools for harvest now forged blades for defense. The same minds that built homes now built fortresses. And so, even as civilization bloomed, its roots were watered in blood, because to belong somewhere always means someone else does not. By 5,000 years ago, humanity had built something entirely new: cities. Massive walls of mud, brick, and stone rose from the plains of Mesopotamia. Inside them, thousands of people lived together, eating, trading, worshiping, dreaming from above. Places like Uruk and Ur looked peaceful, but their walls told another story. You don't build fortifications that high unless you're afraid of something. And the truth was, every city was someone else's conquest waiting to happen. In the beginning, the wars were small: raids over irrigation canals, stolen livestock, or fields of barley. But as cities grew richer, so did their ambitions. Armies began to march, kings began to rise, and gods began to take sides. One of the earliest written records of war comes from a clay tablet, the stele of the vultures. It shows ranks of soldiers marching in formation, helmets gleaming, spears aligned. Their leader, King Eannatum of Lagash, tramples enemies beneath his chariot wheels. It's both horrifying and beautiful, the first time human violence became art again. Like those cave paintings thousands of years before, only now. It was organized. War wasn't chaos anymore, it was strategy. It was politics. It was destiny, and somewhere deep inside those walls, a new kind of memory was being born. One not painted in red ochre, but written in cuneiform, the story of who won, who lost, and who deserved to rule. Because in the first cities, memory itself became a weapon. As centuries passed, the line between the battlefield and the temple began to blur. Kings no longer fought for food or farmland, they fought for the favor of the gods. In Mesopotamia, Egypt and beyond, rulers claimed divine blood. Their victories weren't just military triumphs. They were proof that the heavens had chosen them. When armies marched, they carried idols at their front. When cities fell, their gods were taken captive, dragged away like prisoners. This was the dawn of holy war, long before the term even existed. In the Sumerian poem of the god Ningirsu, a deity commands his chosen king to strike down a rival city. The king obeys, his soldiers tearing through walls as if fulfilling prophecy. It was no longer man's will that started wars, it was destiny, but divine right came with divine terror. Kings now had the authority to demand loyalty beyond reason, sacrifice beyond mercy. Soldiers died not for land, but for eternity. Every victory parade, every temple carved with scenes of slaughter carried the same message. Your God was stronger. Your enemies were forgotten. The cycle fed itself. Each empire built upon the ashes of the last. Each claiming their rise was ordained by the heavens. And the blood that soaked the soil of Mesopotamia flowed down through Egypt, Persia, Greece, and Rome, each repeating the same truth humanity first learned at Talheim, that when war is sanctified, it never ends. Every great city stands on something older, something buried. If you could peel back the layers beneath the streets of Ur, Thebes, or Rome, you'd find not just pottery and tools, but bones, thousands of them. Each layer tells a quiet truth, that civilization wasn't built after war. It was built because of it. Walls were born from fear. Law was born from vengeance. Order was born from the chaos of survival. And yet, even through all the ruin, humanity created beauty. Out of conquest came architecture. Out of blood came art. We learned to write, to record, to remember, perhaps because we couldn't bear to forget what we'd done. Today, when we look at a skyline, at the glass towers, the shining bridges, the lights that pierce the night, we see progress. But beneath every structure, whether made of stone or steel, lie the same foundations: struggle, unity, and the will to endure. That's what makes us human. Not the wars we fight, but the fact that we keep building anyway. Every civilization that rose and fell left behind one message carved into the bones of the earth. We were here. We fought. We remembered. And maybe that's the truest story ever written, that beneath every empire, every wall, every temple, lie the echoes of those who picked up the first stone, not to build, but to survive. So, What did we really inherit from the people who came before us? We like to think we've evolved, that our cities, our laws, our technology have lifted us beyond the savagery of our ancestors. But the truth is quieter and far more human. Every time we draw a border, defend a belief, or fight for what we love, we echo them, those first farmers who guarded their fields, those first hunters who painted their fallen on stone, those first kings who carved their glory into walls of clay. Their story didn't end thousands of years ago. It became ours. Maybe that's why their echoes still live beneath every foundation, every flag, every monument, because in the end, civilization was never just about building walls. It was about what we chose to protect inside them. And that's the haunting beauty of our species. We destroy. We rebuild, we remember, and somehow we keep going. So the next time you look at a ruin, a skyline, or even your own reflection, remember, you're part of a story that began long before history had a name, a story written in blood, in stone, and in memory.